like 2 or 3 years after
Right,
he was
I know,
born.
very
But
nativity
it's a whole different scene,
scene,
right? It's a whole different
Well, that's
scene.
why Herod had everybody 2 and under killed.
That's right. So because he thought not only, well, gee, they're going to take over my throne, he was going to slaughter the possible Parthian next emperor. Whole different take. Stephen Collins does some reading on this. But the interesting thing is, if you don't know about this, you have this whole kingdom that we didn't even hear about. And yet, they were right there contending with this power struggle. Anyway, the point is, we've got all these different things going on that we never hear about. And the fact about the Parthian emperors was as soon as somebody became emperor, he'd kill all his family. He'd kill his cousins and his uncle and his parents and his brothers. And that's the curse that David incurred when he had Uriah killed. And Yahweh said, the sword's not going to leave your family. Well, we're thinking, well, Parthian history, those guys were sure mean to their relatives. And it's like, that's the lineage of David. Yahweh's word is true all the way through, even though it's lost record of it. My point is, if Yahweh has principles of his kingdom, how it works, I'm not sure which one it is. There's this other one where he... gosh, there's so many different ways to go here. There's this other verse. These notes are like just barely written down. You know, I'm writing them down and say, oh, I know exactly what it is. All I have to look at it and go right there and it's like, oh, I don't know what I was saying.
Like my notes.
Yeah, mine too.
If you read in Jeremiah, especially like chapters 5 through 8, you can sit there and there's so much stuff in there if you look at it in Hebrew. But in this one place, Jeremiah 5:5, he says, this is pertinent, Jeremiah 5:5. Back up a little bit. Yahweh, are your eyes not toward truth? And here's another interesting thing I found elsewhere. Nikad, nikt. Kuf is also like this microscope where Yahweh says, I'm going to look right here. Does anybody want to be in my eye? Come over here. Stand right here. Because this is where I'm looking. And other people say, oh, his eyes scan the whole earth. He sees me. He knows my heart. Well, I've found verses and words which indicate that this is what Yahweh does. He says, I'm looking right here. And if you guys want to have me in your eye, stand here and go. Are your eyes not toward truth? Therefore, it says, you have stricken them, but they have not felt sickened. You have nearly annihilated them, but they have refused to accept discipline. They made their countenances harder than rock. Their face, they refused to repent. And as for me, I have said, these must only be the impoverished ones. Now, the word impoverished there is the word for Dalet Lamed, Dal, as in Dalet, Dalet Lamed Yod Mem. Well, Yod Mem is plural. And if you look at the word Dalet Lamed, it means poor, weak, emaciated, drooped down, low, vulnerable. And so he says, these guys that are completely blowing off the covenant, they must be the scum-eater.
Yeah.
They must be the illiterate, poor, no education, no means, and they just feel so beat up by life, they're going like, Torah Shmora, whatever. Well, the interesting thing about Dalet Lamed, it means to hang down, and as Yeshua is the Dalet that was gimmeled to the earth, he is Yahweh, the infinite one of all power, who reduced himself, hanging down, making himself impoverished and vulnerable so that he could be attacked by us. So in that picture of even Dalet Lamed, you see there's a prophecy of Yeshua. He made himself vulnerable for us to rip him apart. Like you take your hand and drop it into a snake pit for the vipers to bite you, or in a bag of scorpions for no good reason. They act foolishly. I said to myself, these people that are doing such crazy, stupid stuff, they must be the poor people who they act foolishly, for they don't know the way of Yahweh. The law of their Elohim. The law of Elohim. The way Elohim established the universe, which is the way it works, which is what comes around, what goes up, goes down. all those isms that you can say. They don't even know. So he says, I will go to the leaders and speak to them. For they know the way of Yahweh, the law of their Elohim. But I saw that together they had broken the yoke, snapped the straps. Broken the yoke, snapped the straps. Yoke. Well, Yeshua said something about a yoke. He said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Yoke. How do you break a yoke? You have a cross beam, and you get 2 straps, and you hang on the basket. Well, if you say, well, you break the yoke is a cross beam, so you must have to bust the yoke. You break the yoke by cutting the straps that by this hang. The yoke is broken. You didn't have to just cut the cross beam. So the rabbis came up to Yeshua, the Pharisees, and said, what's the greatest commandment? He said, love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength. And the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang, wait a minute, on these two hang. On these two hang. Wait a minute, are these things that are hanging on the yoke, or is this the yoke? On these two hang the law and the prophets. Well, if the prophets, law and the prophets, the Torah and the Nevi'im, are hanging on this yoke, then the yoke is love Yahweh, love your neighbor as yourself. And what hangs on that is all the prophets and the law. But he says, you guys have cut the straps. You have a yoke. Oh yes, we love Yahweh and we love our neighbors ourselves. We've got this bar, the church is easy and light, but there's nothing hanging on it. You've busted it. You see, when you read this and you look back at that, but then you say, well, wait a minute, the word for cutting is, well, the word here, well, this gets into a whole other word study. I don't know if you want to get into this kind of detail, but it talks about shiver, sheen, bet, resh. And then there's this other word that says, therefore, because you've broken the yoke and cut the straps, the lion of the forest struck them. The wolf of the deserts vanquished them. The leopard stalks their cities. Whoever leaves them will be torn apart, for their sins are abundant and their waywardness is intense. And he goes on, telling you what happens when you break the yoke by cutting the straps. When you get rid of the law and the Torah, nature's going to turn against you. Your enemy's going to turn against you. The plague and the pestilence, and on and on and on. So for us to go back to these laws, these rules, these chok, these mishpat, the mitzvot, is not because we're being stupid. It's because we're being very wise. The word therefore is al-kan, ayin lamed kaf nun, like the al-kan highway. It means therefore. Ayin lamed means yoked to, and kaf nun is where we get the word can, or yes I can, which means a true, thus, verily, absolutely. So when he says, because you broke my yoke of loving Elohim with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and loving your neighbor as yourself, then the yoke you get is that the lion, the wolf, the leopard will tear you apart. But you see, what we're doing here is looking at these words and joining them to other phrases like in Brit Hadashah that are pictographically similar of type. And joining these things together and saying, well, wait a minute, it's almost like playing concentration, with game of cards, that TV show that they used to have, where you turn all the cards over and you flip them over and you try to match pairs. As you learn this Hebrew, you see things that are similar stories and you try to match the pairs. When it says, they must be the impoverished ones, but I will go to the leaders, for they know the way of Elohim. The word for knowing the way of Elohim is Idah, Derek, Yahweh. So here's this word Derek. Has everybody ever heard that before? Huh?
Road.
Road. You can look in the dictionary, and it means more than road. It's also the way, the journey,
right.
your conduit, your conduit or your conduct of your way of walking. Halakha is walking, but Derek, Dalet Resh Kaf, is the road that you walk on. Derek. Reminds me of Derek and the Dominoes. An album that Layla was on by Eric Clapton. It was like, Derek and the Dominoes, that was a great song back in the 70s. You know, you go, wait a minute, Derek and the Dominoes. Now think of this. Makom. Makom is the things that we stand up. Yeshua said something about the man who built his house on the rock without a foundation. When the storm comes, or didn't build his house on the rock, the guy that built his house on the rock, it'll stand. Well, if you know about construction, that foundation can cost you an awful lot of time and money. I mean, I don't know if somebody spent $40,000 just digging down and pouring concrete to make the house stand on a hillside before you ever started building the house. The guy who doesn't build with a good foundation is going to build a nicer looking house a lot faster, but it's not going to stand up. So these things that stand, picture the things we do in our life is like a bunch of dominoes. You stand them up. And Yahweh says, okay, just keep standing up your dominoes. Based on the way you walk the derrick, you'll stand up these dominoes, and when the storm comes, boom, 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 they'll all fall down. But if we keep His ways, when we build these, standing up these dominoes, planting them in concrete, and the storm comes in, it's going to stand. And I thought, wow. Now, from what I understand, this may be gossip and rumor, but I don't know, but you hear, that Derek and the Dominoes in the song Layla had to do with Eric Clapton stealing George Harrison's wife. Well, I've talked about some bad dominoes being stood up, and it's got into other trouble, but that song had something to do with that. I don't know. But the point is, that's some bad dominoes. It's going to make your house fall. And I thought, could Derek and the Dominoes really be such a profound thing that Clapton actually knew this Hebraic thought and go, wow, what have I been doing? And I should correct my ways. And my brother looked it up and said it has nothing to do with that. He had a band called Eric and the Dynamos, and the MC at the club mispronounced it and stumbled over it and called it Derek and the Dominoes, and he thought, oh, that's a cool name, let's put it on an album with that. But see, all I'm trying to say is, we can play around with words, English words, Hebraic thought, and somebody says, you're making stuff up and you're making off track. It's like, no, it's all going back to the principles of the Torah. Because the concept of the derrick and standing up dominoes which can fall, or standing up things which will stand, depending if we walk our derrick according to the halakha, the way he said to walk, is what this is all about. And anybody who says, we don't have to, we can't, and they can find all of these excuses he never intended for us to. Those are the voices of Balaam, Balak, and the Nicolaitans. The victory of the literate over the illiterate. And once you see this, then this isn't about listening to me talk and gee, I'll point out this and that. I mean, there's so many verses here we could go over. The point is, once you know these letters, you say, well, gosh, I don't read Hebrew. I mean, look at all these